What's Coach Chad's experience around exercise-induced hypoalgesia? I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I apologize if I'm not.
You are.
He says, I know he's not a doctor, and he has a little trademark thing after that. Trademark for Chad, from Chad Timmerman. He says, but I'm curious about his thoughts and feel like he'd appreciate the topic. After even a single hard FTP interval, I feel a very distinct internal, and he says this in quotes, blanket of numbness under my skin that can persist for up to 2 hours after a ride concludes. No sensation is diminished but pain. As a chronic pain sufferer, could this reaction mean incorporating 10 minutes at threshold might actually give me an advantage in punchier, more painful races? This is a really interesting question that could go a lot of different directions, Chad. In which direction has the research led you?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and it's kind of a layered one. And what's especially interesting is how astute Drew's observations are. I don't know if he's dug into research literature at all, but some of what he says is so in line with what the literature has sussed out that it makes me wonder if I think he's speaking from a place of knowledge. Otherwise, he's just really good at guessing. So what I'm going to do is to try to cover or broach 3 topics here. First is our influence over pain is multifaceted. Secondly, I want to look at sufferers of chronic pain and make it clear that they commonly utilize exercise to manage pain. This is nothing new. And then thirdly, just discuss the multiple types of exercise that can lead to reductions in pain, because there are a few kinds and it's probably not limited to just those. So to begin, let's just talk about pain in general. And you've probably heard the term pain is in the brain, and it's accurate. And because it's in the brain, it means we have the potential to steer into very, very deep waters here. And I want to manage that depth because this is a huge topic and I can't possibly do it justice with the handful of days I devoted to researching it and the time that we're going to spend on it just now. So I'm going to try to keep it all endurance sport relevant. And then I'll also limit it or include a bit with regards to chronic pain. In terms of pain itself, I did read a particular paper on the topic, and I highly recommend it because I think it was the most interesting paper I read, just in a general sense, a general pain sense, from 2007 by Irene Tracy and Patrick Mante, and it was in the journal Neuron. And in a nutshell, they tout or they make clear how impactful neuroimaging's inception was on granting us insights into pain perception. I mean, everything prior to that had to be somewhat, if not entirely, theoretical. And now you can actually do things to people, look at imaging, see what's happening to different parts of the brain, how much activity is going on, et cetera. So that in and of itself is interesting. But what's especially interesting, or a number of points were actually kind of stood out within this paper. First of which is pretty basic, and it's just a differentiation between chronic pain and acute pain. Chronic being, at least by European definition, pain that persists for more than 3 months. And this being a European paper, they brought up that roughly 20% of the European adult population is affected by some form of chronic pain. Coincidentally, I was reading an article this morning that talked about chronic pain in the United States and said 1 in 5 people are affected. So that number seems to carry across the pond. And given that is, 15 years ago, I don't know if it still stands up, but it probably hasn't improved, I would guess. That's on the chronic side of thing. On the acute side of things, it's more quick onset and then quick relief, right? It comes and it goes, and it is what it is. So you can almost see these 2 things as the difference between disease versus symptom. Right? Disease and chronic pain, I believe, is considered widely a disease, whereas acute pain is just symptomatic, some underlying issue or pathology or injury, whatever it may be. Another point that was interesting from this paper was that pain is not necessarily linearly related to its cause, and the cause is termed a nociceptive input. So a pain perception input. And to further that, the response to pain is affected by what's appropriate or possible, was the term they use, which already shines a light on the fact that there's some subjectivity to this, right? We can decide what's appropriate. We can, within our own context, determine what's possible and move forward accordingly, or deal with the pain accordingly. There was a figure in it that I found especially interesting because it described pain with factors that amplify, attenuate, and color the pain experience, which again points to the subjectivity of this, that this is something we can affect. So then the question becomes how. And there really are a number of ways. On the behavioral side, anything from anxiety, so just anxiety in a general sense. If you're already anxious for whatever reason, it can increase your hypersensitivity, your sensitivity to pain. And then there's pain sensitivity, or I'm sorry, pain anxiety, pain related. So just the idea of the pain that's coming creates its own anxiety. So, we've all gotten, or, for those of us who have gotten COVID vaccinations, just knowing I'm going in and someone's going to put a needle in my arm can create some pain related anxiety that might influence your perception of that painful experience, right? Your mental state. So depression has an impact on how we feel pain. Cognition, how sharp are you today? How well are you thinking? And in terms of cognition, I think of how my RPE is on a workout that I've done 100 times. How well did I sleep last night? How cognitively functional am I today? Because the sharper I am, the easier it is for me to deal with that workout's discomfort. And then your personal beliefs can also influence it. In all of this, I kind of encapsulate into just the single, more general word, your disposition. What's your disposition? And all of these things can alter this pain experience. And then I came across a paper from just last year by Buckingham and Richardson that talked about optimism and grit as moderators of what? Resilience, because they saw resilience as a positive mechanism in managing this pain experience. And I think all of us can agree on that. And what I found especially interesting is they described it as an adaptive trait. And that word is what stood out to me, because it's something that changes with time and experience. An adaptive trait that results in an ability to sustain effective physical and psychological functioning during stressful events, such as experiencing pain, right? So again, something it's a bit within our control. A pilot study back in 2017 looked at ultra marathoners and noted that they, by and large, have supranormal pain tolerance. And that in and of itself is interesting. Endurance athletes being tough is news to nobody, but it's nice to see a study that shines a light on it. But they attributed it to some especially interesting things. One is that they experience less pain-related anxiety. So they're already good with it. They know it's going to hurt. And all of us as bike racers should totally be able to relate to this too. We know going into it, this isn't going to be a walk in the park. I mean, unless you're me and you decide you're going to just get there when you get there and you're not racing it, you know it's going to hurt. The second thing they attributed to, of a few things, was elevated pain tolerance due in part to the reduced avoidance of pain. So they're not seeking to avoid it. Rather, it's more of an accepting attitude than an avoiding one. And that's terribly interesting. Problem is, and they point this out, is it's kind of a chicken or the egg scenario. Is it endurance? Ultra marathoners cultivate a high pain tolerance through their training, or do people with high pain tolerance gravitate towards challenges like ultra marathons? Who knows? I don't know how you would even determine that. And then, as Drew pointed out, he used the term hypoallergenia, which, let's break that down really quickly. Hypo being low, algesia, sensitivity to pain. So we're talking about low sensitivity to pain, and this can be brought on in a number of ways, obviously through drugs and painkillers, analgesics. And familiarity with stress. That's an interesting one. I mean, it's just having experienced something one time can alter your perception of it the next time. Placebo, which is always fun to talk about, but in this case, it really makes it clear pain is where? It's in the brain. I mean, if we can just take a sugar pill and decide that it's a painkiller and feel better because of it, well, it's obviously there's some central mediation going on there. And exercise and anyways can actually affect the pain experience. So I've used the term pain experience a couple of times, so let's discuss it in particular. But in doing so, I want to look at a couple of the more endurance sport relevant aspects of the pain experience. The first of which is a term I saw quite a lot, and man, I've linked to I don't know how many studies over the course of this deep dive, and there are tens, if not hundreds more. This is a huge topic. And this term in particular, conditioned pain modulation, cropped up a lot. And basically, it's just the diminishing of the perception of pain intensity following some form of conditioning. Okay, so to put that another way, you expose yourself to some form of pain, you do something, and then you repeat that exposure, and there's a change in your perception of the pain that second time around. Okay. In line with that is something termed descending pain modulation. And this is just the pathway starting from the brain, translating to and through the spinal cord onto what's called your trigeminal sensory system. And to say that the pain is in the brain is obviously simplistic, but it might be a little more accurate. It's still simplistic to say that pain is interpreted in the brain, because at some point we have to have sensory input, right? We have to get it from somewhere, whether we feel it, see it, smell it, taste it. I mean, we have to get, and I say this not knowing there may be something that's fully contained in the brain. I can't speak to that, but by and large, we need sensory input in order to respond to it. So this trigeminal perception helps us interpret all forms of input: warm, cold, intensity, pain. It's the pathway that allows us to alter our perception of sensory stimuli. It allows us to kind of define, is this less painful? Is this more painful? And this brings us to what all of this is building towards so far: two terms, facilitation and inhibition. Now, facilitation is pro-nociceptive. It leads to the perception of pain, whereas inhibition is anti-nociceptive, leads to the blocking of the detection of pain. Okay. So I hope you see where I'm going with this. Before I continue, though, into the research, I want to talk about how researchers and us can quantify pain, how we can quantify pain. So let's call it pain metrics. I mean, we're in the business of performance metrics. Now we're going to look at pain metrics for a short while. There are different types of pain, basically, or there are different sensations that can be associated with pain. So we can look at heat, for instance, cold, for instance, pressure, and that's the deep muscular tissue sensitivity. So by and large, us on the bike, pressure is what we're describing, is pain in the muscles. Yes, we deal with heat. That's more on the thermal side of things. I can't even wrap my brain around that. So we're just going to look at pressure, pain pressure. Which brings us to pain thresholds. So you may have heard the term pain pressure threshold. This is the pain threshold that relates to pressure. And the pain threshold is simply the lowest intensity that's perceived as painful. So you feel pressure to a point where eventually it registers as painful. And this is generally, there's a good consensus across individuals. So where one person agrees, that they do cold, what's it called? Pressure. I'm not sure if that's what it's called, but basically they submerge their hands in cold water and until they perceive that as painful. So when one person puts their hand in cold water, it's pretty much a consistent temperature across individuals that says, yep, that's painfully cold. Now, so that's more on the objective side. Pain tolerance, however, is more on the subjective side. It has to deal with how much you can stand. So put your hand in that same cold water. How long can you tolerate it? What is your interpretation of the situation? How miserable is it for you? And what's even more interesting about this is how very malleable our interpretation of pain is. And why? Again, because it's in the brain. And this brings me back to just a minor anecdote here, a little diversion. So much of us in our youths and even later in life go through a martial arts phase. And I went through mine in the 90s. And I had a couple of buddies. One friend of a friend was actually the sensei. He was the guy who was the black belt in Taekwondo, the black belt in Jiu-Jitsu. And we're at the community center and we're taking classes from him, but we're also buddies. So we also hang out on the weekends. And no alcohol involved. Just some nights we just decide submission wrestling is the thing that we're going to do. So basically, it's MMA, but well before MMA was as popular or prevalent as it is these days. And we would wrestle until basically you either made your buddy pass out or tap out, right? I mean, that's just the nature of it. No punching or anything, just wrestling. But I would get Pat. He was the sensei, the bad mofo. I would get him in a headlock, and I know he was fading, and I would just have to wait it out. And he would grab my rib cage, grab the flesh on my rib cage, and just dig his fingers into it. And it worked like a charm. Every time he would do that, I'm off him. I mean, it was extremely painful, but he had done that enough times, and I had employed my same headlock tactic enough times that I knew it was coming this last time. And I said, nope, I'm going to work through it. And I held that headlock, and he grabbed onto me just like I knew he was going to do. But I decided in that instance, I'm not going to let this be as painful as I've perceived it the past few times. And I held on. Sure enough, he had to tap out. So there's
yeah, this
a
is
true
the most wild example.
But I think about it when I say, how can I tolerate this situation? When I'm on the bike and I'm falling apart and I think, oh, I can't possibly do another interval. And it's experiences like that tell me, yeah, you can decide right now, I can do this. Your body's not going to quit. You're not going to run out of oxygen. You've got enough glycogen in your muscles. You've got a gel sitting right there. all the excuses don't really hold up. So you're choosing to quit. You know that you can tough this out. Okay, so back on track. One more metric. There's a pain intensity rating, and this is really quite simple. It's just, rate your pain on a 1 to 10, 1 to 20, 1 to 100 scale. And what's interesting about this is that it not only differs across subjects, but it differs within them. So one person may rate that cold water as a 6, another person may rate it as a 4 or an 8, whatever. And then that same person, under different circumstances, could rate it differently, right? So all of these things are important because they indicate that we have some level of influence on how we perceive pain. Okay, so all of this steers us to the question, what causes reductions in pain? And I'm just going to look at this briefly from two perspectives. One's physiologically and one's psychologically. So physiologically, we have an endogenous opioid system, which is responsible for the release of beta endorphins. And we did talk about this on the podcast, though, geez, it had to be quite a long time ago. I don't even know if we were into the hundreds at that point, but it is out there. Alternatively, there are non-opioid systems within our body. Specifically, one of them is endocannabinoids, and there are neurotransmitters like serotonin and norepinephrine and things of that nature. And it looks like, based on what I've read, that the exercise parameters kind of determine which system is tapped. For instance, the duration of the workout, the intensity of the work you're doing, is it continuous, is it intermittent, et cetera. Frankly, I'm not sure it matters which system is activated. The fact is, something brings us pain relief, and it happens physiologically. Psychologically, this is where I'm especially interested, is there's something called attention and distraction modulation. So we can effectively direct our focus. And if you think, I've heard this a number of times, I'm suspecting it's out in the wild. It's not just something that I'm privy to, but elite athletes focus on the pain, whereas non-elite athletes focus on anything but. And I don't know if that stands up. I'm sure there's plenty of middle ground there, and I'm sure there's plenty of time where elite athletes are focusing on anything but. So I don't know that that's the strongest of statements, but it conveys the idea. You can focus on the pain, or you can try to distract yourself from the pain. And if you've done any of the workouts with the workout text on, I mentioned this a lot. I say, there are instances where focus on the pain, focus on getting through this last 30 seconds, embrace how this feels right now, versus other times where I try to suggest what I term productive distractions. Focus on something that takes your mind off the pain, but is still productive to what you're doing. Monitor your pedal stroke, your position on the bike, or your eyes on the horizon, et cetera, that sort of thing. So, grant your attention, or try to distract yourself from the pain, or don't do either and just let the workout take the reins, because exercise can, in fact, reduce the perception of pain. And when it comes to chronic pain, this is something that is not news in any respect. This has been happening I was looking at articles from the 70s. So this has been a known thing for quite a long time. So let's kind of dive into how exercise can affect how we perceive pain. First of which, one interesting aspect is that there's general versus specific effects. And as you might expect, it's more pronounced in the exercising muscles than the non-exercising muscles. But there are studies that have shown effects on the painful muscle when a distant muscle is exercised. And this is important because it suggests that there's a peripheral as well as a central pain inhibitory processes in place. So there's stuff going on in the muscle, but there's also things that are mediated by the brain that can affect the body in a more general sense. Then when it comes to the types of exercise that can induce this hypoalgesic response, the research leans specifically, or quite often, on 3 types: aerobic exercise, isometric exercise, which is where you hold the contraction, but the angle of the joint doesn't change. So just, like a plank, for instance. And then dynamic resistance, which is, it's a whole lot of movement without movement. So the joint angle doesn't change, but there's all sorts of muscular activity. So it's like standing on a Bosu ball or an AirX pad or something, where you're holding your balance and your body's pretty static, but there's quite a lot of activity taking place. So I'm only going to look at isometric and aerobic. First off, isometric across the board seems to elicit moderate to large effect sizes. And it does so through low to moderate intensity, leaning toward longer durations. And the point here is that they try to push the muscles close to, or actually to, fatigue in order to elicit the greatest exercise-induced hypoalgesic response, the greatest reduction in pain in thanks to exercise. And it looks like according to most of what I read, that there's no apparent dose response relationship. It's not as simple as just doing something high intensity and kicking back and waiting for the pain relief that should follow. Rather, it's attributed to recruitment of high threshold muscle units, motor units. So basically, we have to get those fast twitch fibers, and you can do that through high intensity, but you can also do it through low intensity with long duration. So you just wait, you just do it long enough, hold that plank long enough to where your slow twitch muscles are fatigued, they tap out, and your fast twitch muscles start to be recruited. And this is what apparently increases the level of exercise-induced hypoalgesia. And this may not seem terribly relevant in our context, but it's certainly relevant when it comes to chronic pain sufferers. And Drew did ask the question with regards to this specific type of pain, these specific people. And as I mentioned earlier, exercise is widely considered an important component of effective chronic pain management. This is, again, not news at all. And isometrics might be the most beneficial way of going about it. So whether you suffer from just some examples, fibromyalgia syndrome, chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic low back, chronic musculoskeletal pain, shoulder myalgia, list goes on, it appears that engaging in moderate to high intensity aerobic work can actually push you to the other side of things toward hyperalgesia. So it can actually increase your pain. Not so, at least not as commonly with the isometrics. In two studies that I looked at, one looked at fibromyalgia sufferers and noted that they preferred low intensity work. They worked at 45% versus 60 to 75% of max heart rate, and they had greater pain reduction at that lower end of things. They also had increased or improved exercises, so better effects in terms of exercise-induced hypoalgesia when they're prescribed moderate intensity level. So the point is lower side of things. Okay, but now let's talk about endurance athletes and look at the aerobic side of things, the aerobic exercise side of things. And specifically, almost every study I looked at was either cycling or running. And they noted that intensity definitely has an effect, whereas duration effect is equivocal. So first, with respect to duration, one study did 1/10 versus 2/10 at about threshold, and noticed that there was no difference in the diminishment of pain between those two. So the same effect after 2/10 as 1/10. Another study looked at 10 minutes versus 30 minutes, and they noticed no difference in the pain reduction with the 10-minute effort, but when they extended it to 30 minutes, significant difference. So again, kind of equivocal when it comes to duration. So I'm not sure there's a heck of a lot of value in focusing specifically on the duration of your aerobic work. Rather, on the intensity side of things, there is a clear dose-response relationship across a lot of different studies, and they lean toward the moderate to high intensities, noting that they elicit the greater exercise-induced hypoalgesic response. The largest effect sizes seem to happen right around 75% of VO2 max, which, you equate that to FTP, it's in the ballpark of 90%. So we're in sweet spot, pushing towards threshold, much like Drew mentioned, and has to be carried out for 10 plus minutes, much like Drew mentioned. So that's to be the sweet spot, and I'll come back to that. When they worked with low intensity cycling, 10 minutes at 50% of threshold, or VO2 max, which put us, 60, 65% of FTP. So endurance work, no significant change in pain ratings. 30 minutes at that same effort level, moderate effect size. And then when they did 10 minutes of high intensity training, small effect size. So the high intensity stuff, if not given enough quantity, didn't seem to effect. So to put all this another way, the most consistently reliable exercise form for exercise-induced hypoalgesia seems to be in that moderately painful region. So basically what Drew said, threshold territory. The one study pointed out that there is a larger hypoalgesic response after painful versus non-painful, which I find pretty ironic in that you have to experience pain in order to lessen it. So you have to give a bit to get a bit. And I guess that can make sense. I mean, you can't lessen pain if it's not there in the first place, but the fact is you got to hurt a bit for your body to respond and make it hurt a little less. So what this shows us is that exercise-induced muscle pain may be tied to the magnitude of the exercise-induced hypoalgesia, but it's not likely the primary mechanism. And I say that because of another study that I came across that used non-painful exercise and still achieved some hypoalgesic response, in particular walking. Walking seems to be widely accepted, and especially for chronic pain sufferers, it is one of the most popular or effective ways to go. And then finally, let's just look at the post effects, because Drew mentioned that he has this blanket of pain that lasts for up to 2 hours after exercise. Couldn't really find anything to support that. Doesn't mean it's not real, but most things looked at the effects lasting maybe 15 minutes post, as long as 30 minutes. But when you start pushing up toward 30 minutes, it's a real trivial effect. And then another study looked at the reduction in pain sensitivity lasting about 5 to 10 minutes post. So it doesn't seem to be a heck of a lot for the idea that work really hard, get this pain reduction flowing, and it's going to carry well past your workout. It's not to say it's not true. There's just, I couldn't come across any evidence of it, scientific evidence. So the overall takeaway here is that all three types of this exercise can demonstrate large effect sizes. Of course, it's transient, but they're all effective ways of going about it. And then finally, just to close out, there are a number of studies, 5, I'm going to be super quick with them, but they were all interesting and I think pertinent. There's some utility to these. First off, exercise-induced hypoalgesia appears to favor, at least in some studies. So in one study I linked to, touts more hypoalgesia in response to exercise for females, which, whether it's real or not, placebo is real. So if you just believe I'm a woman, I get more pain relief from exercise, yay for you. There might be something there. Secondly, age has demonstrated an impact on the conditioned pain modulation. So as we age, it's kind of tough guy syndrome, right? And we talk about masters athletes being tougher, old guy strength, all that stuff. Well, maybe that has something to do with it. But fortunately, there's no change in exercise-induced hypoalgesia. So a lot of literature pointed to the fact age that it doesn't decrease. You still get the full. One very interesting study was the one on competition-induced analgesia. So, and it kind of pointed out the difference between men and women, but I think more it pointed out the difference between psychological engagement, because they used a video game and experienced some level of hypoalgesia on the men's side. Women's side, not so much, but they reasoned that the women were particularly interested in playing video games, so they didn't get as competitively involved in it. What was interesting about this is it kind of shines a light on the fact that there might be a psychological end of things too. So psychological stress can actually bring about a hypoallergenic response. And then one talked about mirthful laughter, which, we're not talking a chuckle or a guffaw, we're talking full on laughing. They had people watch a comedy versus a documentary for 30 minutes, laughed very hard, and it exerted favorable influences on pain tolerance, which I can't help but think when I sit down for my longer, sometimes sweet spot, sometimes VO2 max, and I'm reading, and that's the documentary side of things. So I'm probably making things quite a bit more unenjoyable than they can be. Whereas if I just sat and watched episodes of The Office, maybe I'd have a better workout. And then finally, even getting on the bike just to spin your legs carries benefits. We've talked about this before via the lymphatic drainage, but one study that used manual lymphatic drainage, so I think massage, actually increased pain threshold and pain tolerance, which leads me to posit that maybe exercise-induced lymphatic drainage, spinning your legs, is likely to have a similar effect.
Chad,
and that's all I got.
Fantastic job to you and your internet. It made it through somehow. There were some rough patches, but we made it through. I was trying to not
I was afraid to stop talking.
Yeah, I was trying to not intervene at all because I didn't want to throw you off, and it was working. Fantastic. So I do have one question here, Chad. Based on the research that you've done, has your perspective shifted at all, or where do you stand on the common assumption that kind of like what we talked about with Ivy, in the sense that you kind of need to race yourself into that ability to be able to express your full fitness, right? You show up the first race and it can be really tough. And it's this question of whether it's the fitness that you gain through that, or if it's your ability to be able to deal with that level of discomfort that's novel from the racing experience.
Yeah, I really wanted to have a good answer for this. I wanted to be able to say, here's what to do to make that first ride of the season less painful, or to be more competitive, and honestly, everything I've read makes me think there's still some fitness limitation there. You just haven't had to work as hard as you have to work when you're the one when you're following and not directing, so to speak. There's just nothing I was hoping that the after effects would be like days worth. Having some exposure to this means that next time your perception of the pain associated with it is diminished, and maybe there's something to that. But try as I might, I couldn't really find anything that backed up with research the point I really hoped to make. So I can't tell you.
Yeah, it'd be really tough to prove that, I bet, in like a research sort of a context, right?
Yeah, I don't even know what you'd measure, because if it is, I've seen articles that claim that it's this the rush of endocannabinoids or what's the other side, the opioid system, whatever, that it stays kind of at a higher baseline level, and then it's easier to ramp it back up. But again, I tried to dig into that a bit with the time that I had, and I couldn't find anything that made it a clear-cut case.
Yeah. Ivy, have you considered that very thing before too? Is like, maybe I'm just better at hurting now rather than fitter, like,
Oh, yeah, definitely. But I just can't like let go of the fact that Chad just said he reads on the trainer.
Oh yeah. And listens to classical music
during intervals.
Yes.
Honestly, that nothing passes time like reading. The engagement I get by reading something that's mildly intellectually challenging, it can't be too difficult, makes the time just fly more than anything else, more than music, more than documentaries, more than comedies, whatever.
I'm impressed.
My ADD says no, absolutely not.
Yeah. So this is something that, so whether another chicken or egg thing, I may create this every year going into the race season, but I have noticed that once I get, and it's even if I race a totally different type of racing, it's just getting used to that sort of pain and intensity, because my interval workouts are plenty hard, but racing is a unique type of pain because, it's unexpected, it's novel, it's catching you off guard. There's a lot of different aspects to the discomfort that you're experiencing, because so much of it is psychological as well.
Relevant to this conversation, I do think that stands up. So when we think about that conditioned pain modulation, that is that. But when you experience it in a very controlled, I won't say comfortable, but a very controlled environment on the trainer, you know what power you have to put out, you know how long you have to hang on to it, you know when recovery comes, and then you have to go out and you have to do all of those things that you're not armed with any of that information. I think you have to have some exposure to that in order to condition that response.
Yeah, and even to believe that you can do it, that you'll make it through, right? Since you don't know what's coming up. Sorry, Ivy, I interrupted.
No, that's okay. I think you've talked about this in prior episodes too, when talking about like the confidence you carry we've talked about your needing the ability to suffer in order to get faster and like enjoying that process a little bit. But you've talked about like the confidence you carry from completing a really difficult workout or like in a specific zone that's really hard for you, and how that confidence can help you then in now maybe what we know as conditioned pain modulation,
Yeah,
completely.
Yeah, super interesting stuff. And
Awesome.
at the very least, one thing that, whether endurance athletes already have this preconditioning on board or these increased capacities to be able to tolerate pain, or whether it just comes about from it, no doubt, endurance athletes have a unique relationship with pain, in the sense that, you get long periods of exposure to it for extended, for quite a high percentage of your time, relatively speaking, to average folks.
If you like this video, make sure you give us a thumbs up.
If you didn't like this video, you can give it a thumbs down, but let us know what you would have done differently in the comments below.
If you want to see more of these videos, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to become a faster cyclist, check out TrainerRoad.com.
Do it.